Buonasera, buonasera a tutti, benvenuti a Hello Dead, che è la festa di inizio anno del DAD, Dipartimento di Architettura e Design. Alcuni degli studenti forse non mi conoscono, non ci conoscono ancora. Io sono Michele Bonino, direttore del Dipartimento. Vorrei da subito anche presentare Diana Rolando, vice direttrice del Dipartimento, e Elena Pertusato, responsabile gestionale. Quindi noi tre siamo insieme chi ha la responsabilità, anche il piacere di coordinare in questo momento il Dipartimento. Vedo tantissimi studenti, alcuni anche studenti internazionali. I will mix a little bit the languages in this presentation, and I would like also thanking very much Professor Peggy Dimmer from Yale University, our invited guest today to celebrate this very special day for the department, and she was also part of the jury who awarded the award for the best project and best final thesis of the students of the Department of Architecture and Design. So this will be a part of our event today. Siamo molto contenti, siamo partiti da un anno fa, qualcuno di voi lo ricorda, avevamo fatto qualcosa di simile per inaugurare il nostro mandato della direzione. Abbiamo visto che ci eravamo divertiti, avevamo messo insieme dei contenuti interessanti e quindi abbiamo deciso ogni anno, adesso che i corsi sono iniziati, gli esami sono finiti, ogni anno di fare qualcosa di questo tipo, quindi con una parte qui e una parte sotto, poi dopo con musica e aperitivo. È stato un primo anno interessante e impegnativo dove si sono impostate tante cose nel Dipartimento. Ora inizia un anno sicuramente di realizzazione, cioè dovremo i progetti che abbiamo messo in campo portarli a diventare veri, però alcune cose sono già state fatte e quindi oggi verranno peraltro con una modalità segreta, cioè oggi nessuno sa ancora qual è il nuovo logo del Dipartimento che ha vinto una selezione dentro uno dei nostri corsi di design, del triennio di design, e nessuno, a parte la giuria ovviamente, nessuno sa ancora chi sono coloro che hanno vinto i premi ai migliori progetti, alle migliori tesi e le menzioni. Quindi c'è anche un po' di suspense che farà, immaginiamo, divertente questo evento. Vorrei ringraziare molto chi se ne è occupato, perché è stata un'organizzazione lunga, a partire da Marco Bozzola, che vedo qui, a cui adesso darò la parola perché condurrà lui la parte riguardante il nuovo logo e il nuovo immagine visiva del DAD. Poi Chiara Remondino, che dal 1° novembre prende il posto di Marco come responsabile della comunicazione degli eventi del Dipartimento. Marco è diventato il vice coordinatore del Collegio di Architettura e Design. E poi tutto il gruppo di lavoro eventi che è stato avviato qualche mese fa, di cui questo è il primo grosso risultato in termini di organizzazione ma anche di invenzione. Ci siamo anche abbastanza divertiti a pensare come sarebbe stata la giornata di oggi. Quindi mi fermo, ringrazio tutti, i colleghi, gli studenti, il personale del Dipartimento, anche gli amici e gli ospiti che vengono da fuori, e do la parola a Marco Bozzola che introduce la prima parte di questa serata dedicata al nuovo logo e immagine visiva del Dipartimento. Grazie.
Grazie Michele, grazie a tutti. A me il compito di introdurre appunto la prima delle attività di questo pomeriggio, il primo evento, diciamo così, di evento nell'evento. E sono contento, anche orgoglioso di poter presentare questo lavoro, che è stato un lavoro articolato, un lavoro importante, un lavoro che ha visto la ridefinizione dell'identità del nostro Dipartimento, quindi anche ha rappresentato una ricerca, un'autoanalisi per certi versi, per capire quali fossero poi gli elementi che caratterizzano il nostro Dipartimento e come poterli anche raccontare attraverso poi un progetto di identità visiva. È un lavoro che ha coinvolto la comunità del Dipartimento a vari livelli, attraverso workshop, attraverso incontri, discussioni, ma soprattutto ha coinvolto la nostra didattica, quindi nella fattispecie il nostro corso di design e comunicazione e in particolare attraverso il laboratorio di Communication Design del secondo anno, in cui i nostri docenti e studenti sono stati coinvolti nel sviluppo, insomma nel mettersi alla prova in questa sfida di definizione poi delle caratteristiche di comunicazione del Dipartimento. La cosa ci rende chiaramente particolarmente orgogliosi e felici. I nostri studenti hanno avuto modo di fare un'operazione concreta, insomma, con un obiettivo reale, tant'è che oggi presentiamo proprio l'esito che verrà adottato dalla struttura, dal Dipartimento, e per il Dipartimento è stato chiaramente un modo anche per potersi guardare dal di fuori. Però a questo punto lascerei la parola direttamente ai nostri professori Fabio Guida e Giuseppe Tuttobene, che ci raccontano un po' l'operazione e poi introdurranno anche i nostri studenti. Grazie.
Buonasera a tutte e a tutti, sono Fabio Guida oggi vi presentiamo il progetto che abbiamo condotto con il nostro corso. Tutto nasce un anno fa, quando Michele Bonino, il nuovo direttore, e Silvia Barbero sono venuti da noi e ci hanno chiesto se poteva essere un tema del nostro corso quello di immaginare, di proporre agli studenti di realizzare una nuova immagine coordinata del corso, e noi abbiamo subito accettato con grande entusiasmo, perché abbiamo sempre fatto lavorare i nostri studenti su tematiche culturali e sociali per la città, per istituzioni pubbliche e private, sempre con finalità culturali e sociali, e quindi lavorare per noi era una cosa bellissima, soprattutto per questo iter che è veramente bottom up, poteva come traguardo veramente immaginare la concretizzazione del progetto. Oggi questo per noi è un grandissimo successo che io voglio restituire a tutti gli studenti che hanno lavorato tantissimo, e oggi vedremo un piccolo estratto, però il grande merito, il grande applauso che io vi chiedo di fare adesso che siete concentrati va ai nostri studenti. Iniziamo. Chiaramente tutto nasce, come tutti i progetti, dal brief e dall'introduzione che ci è stata fatta da il direttore, ma poi dalla declaratoria. L'idea era quella di innanzitutto conoscere che cosa fosse il DAD, perché il DAD è una struttura complessa. Abbiamo iniziato innanzitutto nel delineare i confini di quello che avremmo voluto fare, partendo certamente dall'individuazione dei valori, ma poi in immaginare come trasporli in comunicazione e in comunicazione visiva. Perché l'idea non era quella di rifare il logo, ma di immaginare un nuovo modo di comunicare, un nuovo modo di essere posizionati all'interno del sistema. Quindi qui abbiamo poi elencato tutta una serie di strumenti che sono stati alla base delle analisi dei progetti degli studenti. Tutto parte dalla lettura della declaratoria e poi dagli incontri successivamente fatti, ma i valori erano molto chiari: internazionalizzazione, autorevolezza e competitività nelle missioni didattica, ricerca e terza missione, che facevano parte delle cose da valorizzare all'interno della strategia di comunicazione e di supporti. Il DAD è cosa molto complessa, l'abbiamo scoperto insieme nell'immaginare una infografica che rappresentasse da tutti gli organi, tutte le persone, tutte le azioni che all'interno giornalmente centinaia di persone fanno, e quindi la prima cosa era cercare di mettere ordine e capire chi facesse cosa e per chi. E poi il DAD è un'istituzione, è un dipartimento che ha tantissime sedi e tantissime aule, uffici, centri di ricerca, laboratori, e quindi è molto complesso. Per non parlare delle persone, quindi dei target o delle attività che tutte queste persone fanno all'interno del Dipartimento, ma anche e soprattutto all'esterno, cioè l'immagine che si vuole dare del nostro Dipartimento. Quindi abbiamo lavorato su delle sintesi per cercare di valorizzare i concetti principali, e anche attraverso due workshop che abbiamo fatto con i docenti, in modo da trarre anche altre suggerimenti anche dal corpo docente e degli altri facenti parte del DAD. Abbiamo iniziato quindi a fare delle domande all'interno di questo workshop partecipato, che poi adesso non andiamo a leggere tutte quante, ma l'idea era quella di avere delle suggestioni che diventassero stimolo progettuale per gli studenti. Qui ne vediamo alcune. Quali azioni concrete possono intraprendere i docenti per una promozione orizzontale del DAD? E allora i docenti si sono espressi con alcuni concetti: accoglienza, accessibilità, presenza con progettualità, territori, ricaduta pubblica. Quali dovrebbero essere i canali di comunicazione del DAD, esclusi quelli convenzionali? E allora si sono espresse diverse tipologie di merchandising, camminate urbane, podcast, scuole, flash mob. Ci siamo divertiti a immaginare di decontestualizzare. Quali sono i selling point del DAD? E anche qui sono venute fuori dipartimento transdisciplinari, didattica esperienziale. Insomma, questo solo per dire che c'è stato un coinvolgimento molto intenso anche da parte del corpo docente. E qui adesso veniamo ai risultati del corso, del laboratorio, che qui esprimiamo solo in estrema sintesi. Il laboratorio è un modulo con 3 corsi, 8 docenti, e qui vediamo tutti i 3 moduli, ad esempio la comunicazione, i sistemi di produzione in campo grafico e teoria dei linguaggi, che hanno contribuito alla complessità del progetto di comunicazione. Chiaramente i protagonisti sono stati gli studenti, che erano 136, divisi in 26 gruppi in 21 settimane di lavoro. Il telecomando fa tanta suspense. E qui ci sono i loghi dei gruppi, questo e questo, sono i risultati solo dei loghi, perché poi ciascuno di questi progetti aveva la strategia di comunicazione, gli applicativi video, e quindi la strategia applicata su multisupporto. Quindi per questo dicevo prima che c'era stato moltissimo lavoro, e qui ne vediamo solo una sintesi. Questi sono quelli, ve li faccio rivedere, questi e questi. Sono rimasti in corsa questi 2 loghi, che sono stati selezionati da un comitato ristretto, che poi sono stati diciamo oggetto di un sondaggio a tutto il Dipartimento con votazione. Rullo di tamburi: il vincitore per uno scarto piccolissimo è questo. E quindi questo è l'adattamento ora vedremo ora vedremo diciamo degli applicativi di questo logo con l'acronimo in affiancamento al logo del Politecnico, in forma contratta, sui colori istituzionali, quello rosso del Dipartimento e quello blu del Politecnico. E qui adesso vediamo un piccolo reel. Se si può alzare. Chiaramente poi ci sono declinazioni su palette cromatiche che si stanno normando e quindi ci sarà una palette secondaria di colori che verrà utilizzata in funzione di supporti che adesso stiamo costruendo e che sono dai social, dalle storie. Chiaramente il sistema molto flessibile e geometrico lascia tantissime possibilità di applicativi e anche interagendo tra tipografia e fotografia. Questi sono alcuni dei supporti che stiamo immaginando. Copertine, colori un po' vivaci, questo è tutto. Grazie mille.
Allora, adesso chiameremo gli studenti, insomma, che hanno speso il loro tempo per arrivare a questo risultato, e quindi chiamerò i 5 studenti del gruppo, insomma, vincitore, a cui verrà consegnato un buono, un coupon per un viaggio alla Biennale Internazionale di Design di Saint-Étienne, quindi viaggio, albergo e insomma, un weekend culturale. E poi chiameremo anche i secondi classificati, che comunque sono naturalmente dei vincitori anche loro, essendo arrivati in finale, e quindi anche loro riceveranno un premio riconoscimento. Quindi io chiamo Sofia Caterina Nucera, non c'è oggi, ok, siete solo... Vabbè, io li leggo tutti, esatto, e poi voi prenderete. Alessandro Rossi, Dario Bucca, che sei tu. Maddalena, ok. Madalina Golimbowski e Isabel Acunzo, che è qua. Complimenti, quindi a voi
il buono anche per i vostri dateglielo
esatto,
loro.
esatto. Mi raccomando,
No, questo...
sentite i vostri compagni, anche loro.
Complimenti.
Complimenti ancora, e chiamerei anche il secondo gruppo, quindi vabbè, applauso d'obbligo. E quindi stanno arrivando, quindi Valentina Cannarito, eccola qua, complimenti, Silvia Cassinelli, Matteo Carlo Castelli, Riccardo Ceccati e Matilde Cecconello. Non c'è? Vabbè. Complimenti anche a voi. Grazie e buon viaggio naturalmente.
Grazie mille. Grazie, complimenti ancora. Quindi da questo momento adottiamo questo logo. Il logo da immediatamente, poi tutta la parte svilupperemo ancora anche col vostro aiuto tutte bene i vari documenti che il professor Guida ha mostrato e quindi poi dal 1° gennaio anche tutto il resto, cartelline, carte intestate, eccetera. Now I would like to invite to the stage Professor Peggy Dimmer for her lecture. Peggy was a member of the jury, so after the lecture we will also deliver the awards to the students. But first of all, please, Peggy, join the table. And thank you very much for coming for your second time this year, so you are already a friend of our department. Peggy Dimmer is an emeritus professor at the Yale University in US, and also the founder and the principal of the firm Dimmer Architects. And among her most important publications, I would like just to mention for Routledge Architectural Labor, that is probably a starting point for your lecture today, but also many other like Architecture and Capitalism, in 1845 to the present, also for Routledge, and also the Millennium House for Monacelli Press. So today you are presenting to our community, our students, our colleagues, the lecture Working on Work, Architecture and Labor. Thank you very much for coming to our school.
I want to say how honored I am to be here. I think this is an amazing day for the students. I think it's an amazing day for design. I think this is an incredible room. I think a School of Architecture and Design that's in a castle like this is just extraordinary. So it's very much an honor for me to be here. I have to say I feel a little embarrassed because my talk, one, is slightly autobiographical, which is not what I normally do, and I don't want you to be paying attention to what I have done. I'm very much hoping that when I go through my reflections about work or rethinking work, that you identify with it in some ways, so it's more to make these ideas more intimate and more personal for you. I'm also a bit embarrassed because it very much is from an American perspective. And again, you may not relate to the institutions and the comments that I make, but again, I'm hoping that if there's not that much analogy between what I have experienced and what I'm trying to critique in the American context, that there is enough similarity to issues and institutions that you're familiar with so that you are invited to think about what the analogous condition is for you here. And finally, I'm a little bit embarrassed because a lot of what I will be talking about is a critique of the profession as I know it. And inasmuch as this is a day of celebrating design and architecture, it feels a little weird to be presenting a critique, but I want to say that that critique is only because I love architecture so much, and I want architecture to be more relevant and respected than it is, that I want architects and architectural work to be more known, better compensated, and more relevant. So take this talk in that spirit, okay? Okay, I've heard this is supposed to be hard. There we go. The talk is divided into two parts. They're not equal parts, but the first will deal with my architectural work. which is in some way a backdrop to how I got to think differently about the profession, which is to say, I was in it, hook, line, and sinker, and this work that I will show is part of that. And then the second part will be, again, reworking and rethinking what the nature of that is. So for the first part, which is to, whoa, push the wrong one, sorry, which is to think about the architectural work, there are basically two parts of this. One is the traditional work that I did with my partner, Scott Phillips. The work was under the name of Deemer Phillips. The second is work that I've done more recently, kind of post rethinking the profession. And so, yeah, we'll get there. So again, in the US, the typical trajectory for a small firm, and ours was a small firm, is to start with apartment renovations, and then you move on, if you're lucky, to additions. If you're even luckier, you move on from additions to freestanding houses. And if you're really lucky, you'll move on from houses to institutions. We were part of that trajectory, and so we'll kind of go through that. But this is just an example of one of the apartment renovations that we did, the Sandler apartment. This was a very traditional apartment. We divided it into rooms. We took down all of the walls and basically made a decision to make the exposed structure be part of the deal. And so the columns that we see there, the fireplace that we see there are seen as kind of objects and elements around which the rest of the design had to dance. Again, as I indicated, if you're lucky, you move on from apartments to additions. We got this project in upstate New York. It was a fun project. It was just in a kitchen addition, but it was fun to think about how a new kind of space or a new kind of shape could work in a modern fashion, but still work with the traditional pitched roof vocabulary of that area. And then we did move up to houses. And I'm just going to show you some of those houses. I think there were 7 or 8 that we did, most of them on the East Coast. I would say if there was an ongoing directive for how we approach the houses, it was really to think about how the houses shaped landscape, created outdoor rooms, and worked with the landscape, or saw itself as a backdrop to the landscape. So this is the Lieberberg residence. This is the Bala residence. These are all in Long Island, New York. This is the Williamson residence in Connecticut. And then we did actually get institutional projects. And this was, I call it a link building because the program was to make a building that would link these older buildings that you can see kind of on either side of it. And it was supposed to be something that would have corridors, stairs, and elevator. And they had fired the person who had been the interior designer for one of those buildings because they couldn't make it look reasonable, that link building. We were hired to do something that was, I don't know, something design-wise better. What we ended up doing was discovering that it was no more expensive and, in the end, more sympathetic both to the courtyard that was being made between our building and the 2 others, but also stylistically more sympathetic to have a kind of background building than to have a complex network that was trying to stylistically work with the other 2 and was basically showing off the complexity of that series of passages. And for the same amount of money, we could put in classrooms. So classrooms were not part of the of the brief, but it was the same amount of money to basically get them classrooms as well as connections. And then finally, we were given a whole new campus building, Stetson University. This is in Florida. The round form of this came from the fact that the exterior context, or the kind of urban context within which this worked, was fairly neutral in every direction. There wasn't a clear context that would say front or back or side. So the round building is basically a contextual response to say it had to face equally in every direction. But that round building then gave us the opportunity to really organize the building around what would be the most public space, the lecture space, and at the same time have that space open up to the sunny porch or sunny outdoor area that was in the back. So that's kind of it for Diemer and Phillips. And so now I will go to recent work, which in some way is a reaction to that work. This is a project that I did for myself. It's in New Zealand, where I spend 4 months of every year. In many ways, it's different. It's different because I had no money. But I had become critical of the fact that the Diemer Phillips practice was basically just working for rich people. And that was why I left that firm. So when I came back to doing a residential project for myself, I automatically took care of that not working for rich people, because I was not. But it also was a desire to do something that was completely not a look-at-me building, and very much use the vernacular kind of barn outbuilding vocabulary. Basically, the house which you see to the left is a one-bedroom home, but I knew that I had to make room for visiting friends and family, so I basically designed this to have a porch that could hold tents that would basically work like rooms when I needed to accompany other people. I'll just say that the idea of the design was basically two different spaces caught between a roof and a platform. Underneath one, the one to the left was actually a house. Underneath the other one to the left would be spaces that could take different activities, one of those activities being making rooms for my guests. The idea of the L shape is also partly that the house itself on the left faces the view, but I wanted a roof that would face the north, which is like our south, where the photovoltaic solar panels would be. Those solar panels haven't gotten there yet, but that is also part of the thinking about the configuration of the building. Here's just a look at the materials, a look at what the entry into those two different spaces are like. But what I want to emphasize here, and I should go back, here, it's not just that I designed this for myself and that I kind of had to think about how to make 4 rooms be affordable, but that I worked with the contractor from the start. And the contractor recommended the designer who in New Zealand could do the working drawings, knew the local council, knew what needed to be done in order to pass inspection. This was totally a collaboration amongst the 3 of us. And I am almost embarrassed to say that this is my design because I relied on those 2 people so much. This idea of collaboration, working with contractors from the start, is part of what you're going to hear about as I begin to critique traditional practice, but I just want to say that they deserve as much design credit as I do. So this is just a look at the inside, very simple, very plain. That one cabinet divides the front rooms, the dining room and the living room, from the bedroom in the back, but it's totally simple. But the other thing that I would say about this project is it's 7 acres. I designed a house. I put in a house. You can see on the left how completely bare it was. This was pasture for cattle. There was not one tree or bush on the entire 7 acres. And so one of the projects was how to think about that landscape, how it could be maintained. And I was 100% dependent on the family, the Worsfold family, who had a nursery and were landscape designers, who basically taught me what needed to be done to maintain the land and basically rewild it and make the land healthy. So again, I want to make sure that I get very little credit for that, and very much honored to have worked with them to rethink how that landscape would be maintained. And these are just examples of what they did and the kind of rewilding that's going on there. I will just say just one aspect in terms of how one runs a practice, I guess, that at a certain point I paid for trees, but at a certain point the Worsfolds, Bev Worsfolds in particular, were making sure that the plantings were healthy, that gaps were filled in, and they were basically doing this at their own expense, which is then what led to basically what I would call a barter situation, is like what I got in exchange for that, they got in exchange for my designing Bev Worsfold's house. This is under construction now. So I was very happy about this win-win situation that didn't have no money exchanging hands. So anyway, you're going to get I'm hoping that you've got a hint about a kind of practice that I had that I have become critical of, and the kind of practice that one might think differently about. So reworking architectural work. This part of the talk is divided into 3 different parts. One is rethinking architectural work for workers, which is to say employees. Rethinking architectural work for professionals, which is to say both firm owners and the institutions that define what a profession is, and then rethinking work for the contractors and the constructors. So, workers. And I will just say each of these 3 parts starts with what I would call an aha moment, something that made me think, wow, I should really rethink how we're doing things, because I don't think that they're producing an architect or an architecture that is as influential, remunerated, respected as it should be. So here we're looking at students from the School of Architecture that are about to graduate from Yale, all very excited, very happy. But I know that these students, because I taught them for 28 years, might be excited now, but they're totally nervous about the jobs that they're going to be facing. And what I kept hearing from them is that they were willing to take jobs that paid very badly because they understood that the firms that they wanted to work for were also paid badly. And so they were willing to make the sacrifice because this is just how it worked. And they were sympathetic to that condition. So the real aha moment was when I was in the law school at Yale. For some reason, there was an architecture symposium in the law school, and I went down the hall, and posted on the corridor was the top 10 family-friendly law firms, which is a list that is generated by the women students at the law school. And it basically implies that when a law student graduates from Yale, they should know these things, and that they actually might be in a position to choose themselves who they want to work for, as opposed to praying to death that they're going to get an invitation from anyone. I was just totally struck that you would never, ever see this in a school of architecture. And what was that about? So that was a major thing that led me to really rethink that someone or some organization needed to rethink how to empower architecture in general and architecture students. And that led to my being the founder of the Architecture Lobby. The Architecture Lobby is an organization of architectural workers advocating for the value of architecture in the general public and for architectural work within the discipline. And these are our demands. I'm not going to necessarily have you read these demands because that will take up too much time, but it basically is a way of rethinking the ideology that we have come to believe in, that we should suffer as architects and architecture students and architecture employees for our work. So one of the first things that we did was hand out kind of pledges that as students were graduating, saying that they would not work for a firm that hired that or incorporated unpaid interns, whether even if they were paid, that they would not work at a firm that did not pay interns or did not pay for overtime. The second thing we handed out was a draft of a letter or a form about how you could, as you were going to interview for a job, argue for your value and argue for why you should be paid better. One thing that we did after that was we set up a kind of survey questionnaire that would go out to architectural employees in different firms and ask questions in the hope that we would find architecture firms that we thought could show had exemplary practices. And the idea was that when you looked for a job, you knew as much about how they treated their workers, how they produced their work, as you did about what kind of work they produced. And so there were 6 main areas of questioning here. One is family-friendly. Clearly, this is reaching back to the Yale Law School students' idea that we should care about whether your workplace is family-friendly. 2 is fair pay. 3 is legal labor practices. 4 is gender and ethnic diversity. 5 is transparency. Do they share information about pay? Do they share information about the kind of work that they're getting, why they're taking the work that they're doing? And agency, which is, do you actually have a role in how the principals think about their work or take the work that they do or participate in their 5-year plan or their 10-year plan? The goal was to then make visible exemplary firms. These are just some of the examples of the write-ups. So these were put up on the Architecture Lobby website, as well as published in one of the leading online architecture journals, so that they would get exposure for the quality of their labor practices. More aggressively, in order to take care of this problem, we also began to advocate for unionization in architecture. I don't know what it's like here in Italy, but basically the words union and architecture, I don't think has ever been spoken together in the US before this. Just like architecture, labor was 2 words that you would never hear before, but that's part of our work. So we were basically training architects to know how to gather workplace support in preparation for a collective bargaining agreement. We were successful in getting workers to start a union. The lobby itself is not the union, but we got the ability to have them start one. It is called the Architectural Workers United. It's a part of the Mechanics Union. We were delighted when we got 2 successes. 2 firms have been unionized in the United States, and it kind of proves that one can actually be a respected worker and an excellent designer at the same time, and those are not incompatible ideas. I'll say for these 2 successes, there were 2 losses that maybe got more attention than these 2, because the firms who present themselves as liberal, open-minded, avant-garde were the first as firm owners to make sure that they hired legal experts to make sure that the unionization effort would not work. Big, big money to make sure that unionization would not work. So, second part, professionals. The idea of being your own partner, having your own design firm, whether it's big or small, is totally appealing. It was appealing to me. Loved it up to a certain extent. But behind that certain cachet is really a tough enterprise. In order to make money, in order to have your own work-life balance as a firm owner, it can be messy and not glamorous. But one of the things that I think made me have this particular aha moment about the profession was when I was at a conference. It was leading women architects, and they're all talking about their work. It was fabulous work, smart women. And somebody at the end raised their hand and said, "What can I expect from a career in architecture?" And one of the women said, "Architecture is not a career, it's a calling." And I thought, wow, this is how ideology works, which is the poorer I am, the holier I am. Please don't pay me. And that pissed me off. That then led me and a colleague in the architecture lobby to visit our main architectural professional organization, the American Institute of Architects, to go and ask why they don't argue for better fees as well as better wages. They were very polite. I think they were humoring us, but the reality was they said that the Institute for Architecture and Urban Studies has been sued twice by the Justice Department for breaking antitrust laws, which is to say that when they talked about fee schedules, and fee schedules are basically something that says in a certain area for a certain size project, architects will be paid a certain amount of money, that fee schedules were illegal, there were collusion, there were foreign monopoly, and you could not do that. And when they were sued twice at different times, it was at huge expenses and with a lot of threats from the Justice Department to never mention fees or wages at any AIA meeting again. And they basically said that if we in the architecture lobby wanted to talk about these things, we too could be visited by the Justice Department. It wasn't just the AIA as the national organization that could be sued. Any architects who were heard talking about agreeing on certain fees or wages, $10,000 fine, 10 years in jail. So we thought, oh. But it certainly made me think that, it made me think about the fact that in law and in medicine, in real estate, we do know that there are certain fees and certain wages that are being paid. They're agreed upon. And how could it be true in those professions and not in ours? So that led me to look at the American Institute of Architects professional organization in comparison to other countries' professional architects associations to see whether we were particularly bad in the US and whether we could learn anything from other architecture associations. I'm not going to make you go through all of these things, but these are what you see in the black up there are different conditions that I thought led to or prevented a certain power of the architecture profession within the government, within the population, within society. The long and the short of it was that each country's professional architectural association was so embedded in that country's economic and cultural hegemonic project that there was no way of extracting ideas from them into the American thing. So in some way, my inquiry was unsuccessful. But nevertheless, I do want to point out a huge difference that to me was enlightening between the American version and the Swedish version about how a profession sees itself and organizes itself. Where the American AIA. You don't have to be a member. It's fraternal. You can join it if you want, but they want you to believe that you have to join it, which you don't. It has no relationship to the government, has no power. In as much as most of the projects are private, there's no reason for the government to be interested in architecture or architecture to be interested in the government. It has no lobbying power. It doesn't speak for employees. It doesn't speak for the profession. It doesn't have any relationship to construction. All of these things. Sweden, on the other hand, and no unions. Sweden, on the other hand, their professional organization is a union. And that union is a part of the government. And not only that, but that union is a union of employees, not employers. Employers are part of another union that has another way, another entry into the government. They don't have licensure. Anyone can call themselves a license, an architect, and the way that you might, as a client, think about the difference between a plumber calling themselves an architect and someone trained as an architect to call themselves an architect is through their education. And what that means is that the education is the most important thing to them, and the quality of the education is something that's not just there in the academic context, but ongoing research and intelligence when you're in a profession. It's interesting to me also that in Europe, Swedish architects are paid more than any architects in other countries, which kind of debunks the theory that I think operates in the US with the AIA, that the more privileged, the more exclusive you are through the rigors and the difficulty of getting a license, the better paid you're going to be. Not true. Where you don't have that indication, they're paid better. Okay, so then how does one work around this? Certain members of the architecture lobby began to think about cooperatives as a way to fight the forced competition that antitrust laws and the American capitalist system was forcing upon us, and couldn't architecture firms work as cooperatives? And there are two kinds of cooperatives. One would be a worker-owned cooperative, which would basically say that all the employees and the starters of the firm would be owners. Basically, it is the case that capitalism doesn't like cooperatives either. And so legally, as a profession, you cannot be a business entity that's identified as a cooperative, but you can still function as a cooperative by certain workarounds and certain bylaws. We found an architecture firm that does function as a cooperative, and we can see the complexity of their relationship, which is on the left. And just to say, when you are a worker cooperative, it doesn't mean that everyone makes joint decisions, everyone gets equal pay. There still is a hierarchy of management and administration. It's just that everything is agreed upon. There is not one way that the office works or takes works or produces works that isn't agreed upon by everybody. How pay is distributed, agreed upon by everybody. But it's complex. And anyway, one of the things that I'm proud of is that one of our members then wrote a manual about how to set up a worker co-op. And so this is a manual that you see here. But in addition to that, we began to think about worker cooperative networks, which is to say architecture firms that work cooperatively with each other, and in that way can begin to compete with and perform like larger firms, which is to say you share knowledge, you can share workers, you can share resources, you can share in the costs of your lawyers, of your PR people, of your engineers. You can really work at scale. And this too is a fairly complex way of doing that. It requires a lot of transparency amongst firms. If you really are going to be sharing workers, for example, you need to have an agreement about how people are paid and how distribution is done. And I'm just trying to show, we were advising one group of architecture firms that wanted to work as a cooperative network. And one of the things that you need to do before you go to the lawyer to set up that business entity is go through a lot of decision-making about who does what, how new employees are brought in, when you actually have something to say. And so I'm just trying to say that it's an issue that needs to be studied. Constructors, okay, this is my last bit. This is my big aha moment. I went to a kind of small conference that was set up by women at Columbia Architecture School called Who Builds Your Architecture? And at that event, they were trying to get architects who were building in the Emirates to come and talk about that work and their relationship to the illegal labor practices that were happening in the Emirates, building their fancy architecture. They could not get one architect building in the Emirates to come, not one. And so that left the discussion for people like me to basically talk about how embarrassing it was that we could not in any way identify with those workers or have any empathy for those conditions. What was interesting for me and what I learned at that event is that artists whose work were going to be shown in Frank Gehry's Abu Dhabi Guggenheim Museum were refusing to have their work shown. And the reason that was interesting to me is because I think one of the excuses that architects have about why they shouldn't care about labor, our labor or construction labor, is because we're artists. And here we had artists themselves who were taking very radical, very difficult decisions for themselves, and we architects could not do that. Okay. I should probably move quickly, but in addition to that aha moment was my reading a text from Ed Ford's Details of Modern Architecture. Basically, you can read this, but the thrust of it is basically said that in the 19th century, if you were a socially concerned architect, you were primarily concerned about those people who were producing your buildings. If you were a 20th century architect and you were concerned about the social implications of your work, you basically cared about the user. And my feeling is, why in the 21st century couldn't we care about both? And why had we lost that 19th century concern? So this led me to do a lot of work with my colleague Paolo Tombesi, who was then chair of construction at Melbourne University and is now Dean of Construction and Architecture at ETH, whose main work is about the fact that we need to have a totally different idea of design if we wanted to think about all the other people, including the constructors, who were part of getting a building out there in the world. And so for him, what do we mean by design? A problem-defining, problem-solving, information structuring activity that, on the basis of understood goals, conditions, and rules, defines a specific course of action. And these are just diagrams that kind of indicate what begins to happen when we don't think of architects as the center of the enterprise or the top of the pyramid. We begin to think about all the players who are involved in this, and our particular consultants that do that. So on the left, we're already beginning to find different spheres of influence, of which we can kind of identify architects as in one area, constructors in another, building maintenance in the other. But still in the left, there is the building design is kind of seen as the center of that. You might identify this with Revit. You know, Revit is basically that opportunity to have a single model that the owners, the fabricators, the constructors, the architects can all work on. That still holds the building at the center. The more radical one is having the project design be at the center of that enterprise. This then led me to also think about our contracts, just to say one reason that architects could say that if they're building in the Emirates, they don't really care about how they're being built is because the architects have no legal obligation, no contractual obligation to the constructors. Which is basically what we're seeing there on the left is, that's right, the owner has one contract with the architect on the left, has another contract with the contractor on the right, and there's nothing that binds the architect and the contractors together. So fairly recently, a new kind of contract had come up, integrated project delivery, IPD, which is radically different, which makes all three main parties, the owner, the contractor, and the architect, work collaboratively together and share profits together. I was stunned by a model like this that would happen in a tradition that came from that division of labor over on the left. So I got interested in contract theory, and it turns out that there really was, in the 60s, two legal theorists who began to criticize, not just in architecture, but criticize standard legal contracts that were generally for two parties only, worked because they were a stick, which is, say, you'd get sued if you didn't sued and have to pay if you didn't live up to your contract. They worked for short-term relationships. They were brittle. They were litigious. They relied on being litigious. And the owner risk and profit was centered. This new theory of contracts, called relational contracts, these two legal scholars looked at how businesses actually set up relationships with their purveyors and with their suppliers and saw that there was a totally different dynamic. That dynamic was based on wanting to have ongoing relationships, positive relationships, a sense of trust that it works for you to behave well and it works for me, for you, if I behave well. And so these relational contracts are ones that work for multi-parties, which producing a building out there in the world is a multi-party thing. It relies on the carrot and the stick, which is to say they're going to share profits. They're meant for long-term relationships. They're flexible. They're litigious-free, and you all share risk and profit. Basically, the way that this works is that the owner will put money aside after all three parties have put on the table very transparently what they want to get out of the project. If for the designer that is a new brand that's more avant-garde or modern, that's on the table. If it is experimenting with new materials that are not harmful to the environment, whatever those are, everyone puts their issues and their concerns and their priorities on the table. It's agreed upon by everybody. Owner puts the money aside. Everyone works on time and materials. And then when the project comes in on time and budget, everyone shares in the profits. And the profits clearly are understood to be divided differently for the architect, the contractor, and the owner, but it is a shared enterprise. This is basically, I should have a picture now of my house, because it certainly is not integrated project delivery. But I will say that I'm proud of the fact that I hired my contractor first and foremost. We understood the budget. He worked on time and materials as he went. There was never any place where he would come to me and say, this is much harder than you told me it was going to be, and I'm now going to do a change of work order. But he also could come to me and say, the way that you've detailed this is just going to be much more expensive when we can do this. I was completely proud of the fact that it was that collaborative effort. And so the time and materials, no contract was basically the way to go. This is basically what I want to say. I will just kind of, as a coda, come back to my being here. I'm here because I wrote an article for Our Death, and that issue of Our Death was based on competency. I wrote a piece that basically indicated that in order for us to, as architectural educators, put architects out there in the world that could be more than competent, but could be influential and well compensated and respected, and basically leaders in the built environment, as opposed to what I would say is decorating a developer's program that we needed to teach differently. And that is part of proof of my interest in the architecture lobby, interest in that. We conducted 3 virtual summer schools, Architecture Beyond Capitalism, ABC schools. The first one had 3 different themes: capitalism, labor, and collectives. Again, these were all virtual. We had 180 students from all over the world attend it. They didn't pay and they didn't get a certificate. The next year we concentrated on studio, because studio is the particular place where the image of the architect is formed, very often to be egocentric and competitive. And then the third one having to do with future belongings, which is how can we imagine a different future, not just react to what we have and change what we have, but imagine a totally different kind of future. And then the one that's going on right now, which is basically not the architecture lobby and the ABC school teaching a course, but teaching either students or academics in their institutions how to take more ownership of the courses that they think should be taught, or different methods by which classes would be taught, basically helping them hack the status quo. So that, now this is the very last slide, that has led to 7 of us architecture lobby members, ABC organizers, to co-author a book called The Organizer's Guide to Architecture Education. And I want to just say thank you again to those who invited me to be part of our death, because it really set off a trajectory that has ended up, for me, in a totally interesting reworking of architecture education. So I'm very grateful for that. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Peggy. Thank you very much. I think you gave a great contribution, of course, to the students, because it's not so usual for them to, during their classes, to have a view of what's behind the architecture, what happens behind of it. But also for us, the researcher and professor, we are doing in the department research on the innovation of practice. So some of your diagrams about cooperative networks are very inspiring for the research we are doing, and I hope we have the opportunity to discuss more about this. I invite Daniele Campobenedetto for the next part, but I think we have a few, Peggy, you can stay also as the member of the, thank you very much, of the jury. We have time if there are for 1 or 2 questions, so I invite you to take the opportunity, but meanwhile, I just introduced Daniele as a member, as the director of Architettura, that is our platform for education, for promoting education. And Architettura this year, for the first time, promoted the award of architecture in our department that is going to acknowledge the best projects. So it's a great news in the life of our community. So just after the question, we go through the ceremony of awarding the students.
Thank you so much for your mindful lecture. It was really inspiring. I wanted to ask you, because in your lecture, you also tried to envision some modification on firms and other models. No? I would like to ask you if there are even more decentralized models, no? Based on even digital networks. So not just small firms, but very far from each other, no? Even more collective. And if it's possible, so it's a second question, what kind of challenging do you think they are facing? Because, for example, they have not the right, let's say, enough power to lobby or to be present in the public debate, even they can be bigger in the impact on the market. So that's it, in general.
Yeah, I mean, to answer the first question, there really are not that many dispersed cooperative networks, I think what you're basically asking about, that I know about. In the New York area, I showed the diagram of one of the networks that we were working with. There was another one that was a women's WIP, that were a network of women's that were not all that dispersed. They're basically all in New York. But the second one was Design Advocates, which started out as a group of architecture firms during the pandemic who were willing to do pro bono work for businesses, largely restaurants, that were going out of business. And that did transcend the New York area, so it was more dispersed. And they were interested in knowing whether, they were currently a nonprofit, and whether a nonprofit could also be worker-owned. And there were complexities, they're not automatically compatible. But again, this is me maybe not knowing all that much. We were really working with those that came to us for advice. We had lots of models in other industries about that dispersed network. And one of, just to say, I don't know whether this is coincidence, one of those is bakeries who really do have a dispersed network, and the other is solar panels. And so we were learning a lot about dispersed networks from them, but architecturally, I just don't know that many. And the second part of your question is kind of what are the challenges that one finds? In some way, I was hoping that one diagram that I did show, where they were forced to map out relationships that they would have with each other, because one of the things that we knew in working with lawyers was that before you go to the lawyer, you need to know what you want. They're not going to work out your relationships for you. They can make the bylaws, but you need to know who has access, who comes in, how long before you're part of the network. Are you in the research part? Does the research part have the same power and dynamic? When you share workers, are you going to pay them immediately? Are you going to pay them 2 weeks after? All these different things, totally complex. I guess I'm hoping that the complexity of that is an indication of it not being easy. Just to, maybe more than you want to hear as I go down a rabbit hole, but when I was saying that professionals cannot be cooperatives in the kind of business way, it's because the licensing, the people who give license, don't want co-responsibility, co-owner for people who are licensed in a firm with those who are not licensed. And they understand that in most firms, there'll be licensed and unlicensed people, and they don't want that. And that's why professionals cannot actually legally be a cooperative. So then there are workarounds. Basically, you either become an LLC, you become a partnership, there are other economic and business ways to do it, and then you manufacture around that. So it's all workarounds. Does that answer your question? Yeah.
Maybe we can take another question from the audience.
Thank you for your inspiring talk. I'm going on the final part, the relational contract. It looks like that you have experienced the relational contract in your experience in New Zealand with your partners. Do you think that is so common to have this relational contract in other countries? Can you export that into US, for example, easily in big tenders or in big public competition?
Just to be clear, I did not have a relational contract. I had the idea of the relationship contract in my mind when I did it. And the diagram that we saw is a contract that you can get from the AIA. So it exists in the US. I was, when I was at Yale, and I was on the committee that would advise about new construction, I was a big proponent of that. I was not heard, but I wasn't heard for the reasons that you would think that it would not generally work, which is that you don't have a bid situation for the contractor. You're not, you're choosing the contractor at the beginning of the project in a non-bid situation. And that scares everybody because have you started with the right person or whatever. I will just say that Princeton now uses for most of its project the IPD contract, and I've heard recently that Columbia does. So I haven't participated in those, but I've certainly been tracking them. It is the case that one has to get into a different mindset that understands that when you all sit down and lay your cards on the table, your visions, the things that you want to get out of this, that everyone's being truthful. And there's no hidden something or other that comes up that knocks everybody for a loop. It's like, whoa, we didn't know that mattered and it was going to cost this much money or delay the project by that much, which is a mindset that I think is hard in the US, but my feeling is if it happens in the US, it can happen in other places. But just to say in New Zealand, it certainly is the case that I chose the contractor who then chose the designer who did the working drawings for me based on recommendations. And so there is a certain vetting that goes on, and there was a lot of trust. I will just say it was told to me, because I wasn't going to be in New Zealand while a lot of this was done, that I should get somebody who would oversee both that designer and the contractor. That person, total asshole, very much worked from the mindset that we're trying to get rid of, who wanted to control everything, who wanted to make sure that we all fought with each other. He was gone within a month, and our relationships were good. Does that answer?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, it's working. Just a few words before actually proceeding to the announcement of the winner for this first edition of the Politecnico di Torino Architecture Students Award. My name is Daniele Campobenedetto, as you probably noticed from the fact that my name was, without any reason, put near the one of Peggy, which is way more important than me. I am the coordinator of the Center for Design Teaching, and I will just like to say that Architecture Students Award is an initiative by the Center for Design Teaching that aims at highlighting the works of students from the School of Architecture at Politecnico di Torino and to showcase the achievement of our school to a wider audience while encouraging debate on themes and teaching methods. We are recognizing exceptional work today. However, this is not, or is not at least meant to be, just another occasion to emphasize meritocracy critically. There were a lot of studies, including the one from Jean Tirole, a Nobel Prize winner, that highlight the problems and the flaws of this attitude. We all know that the result that we will show today comes from a combination of personal effort, effective guidance from teachers, support from family and friends, and the condition of physical and mental well-being. So what we recognize today is actually works that are important for discuss the future of our school instead of just super works of super women. The initiative thus seeks to foster the dialogue in this community around the results of our everyday professional and scholarly activity. It aims to encourage discussion about how we are addressing global and local challenges, what drives our focus on certain topic, and how we are using research and teaching methods. This is the first edition of the awards, so we would like to expand, to improve, to include more. So please, maybe in the upcoming days, please let us know if something went wrong and how we can improve this experience to everyone. I would like to, just a few thanks around. I would like to express my gratitude to the jury members. So, Professor Peggy Dimmer, Michele Bonino, Simona Della Rocca, and Roberto Giordano. Okay. Together we had the privilege of reviewing your work, often engaging in a deep and lively discussion due to the high quality of the submission. What we saw was, in the vast majority of cases, insightful and meaningful to us. For this, we as jury members thanks all those who submitted their work to this competition, as well as the faculty, the adjunct professors, the tutors, the assistants that followed and tutored those efforts. This project would not have been possible without the support of the Department of Architecture of Politecnico di Torino, as well as the School of Architecture, now School of Architecture and Design, so thanks Carla and Mauro for supporting this effort. And I would also like to thank Rossella Gugliotta e Luciana Mastolia, Dalila Tondo, and all the members of the editorial board of the center for conceiving this award and contributing to its realization. In fact, I'm just a merely representative of the amazing team that is actually designed and realized this award. I would also like to give a special thanks to the Mod Lab for their support in designing and manufacturing the prizes that you see on the piano. Okay, that's it. And without further ado, for the category thesis, I'm pleased to announce the following winners. Winners are ex aequo. That means there's not a first, a second, or a third, but I will just name the 5 winners, one after the other. Discrete block bow architecture, Matteo De Val. For the extensive research, the ability to bring together experimentation and prototyping, tackling the challenge of reuse of existing structures and spaces. Busescu, a manifesto for the Romani vernacular, Maria Cristina Trifan. For the critical perspective on a rather unexplored ground, for expanding the knowledge with a clear method around the link between architecture and Romani society. Continuous Lagoon, transformation strategy for a power plant in the dental landscape, Camilla Bocchieri, Greta Bonini. For the quality of representation, the consistency between research and design proposal, the opening of research questions related to ecologies of transformation of the built environment. Evolutionary housing for post-war reconstruction in Ukraine. Anna Zurich and Daria Zukuskaya. For attempting to reach a wide audience through media and exploring design to empower people, raise awareness to change the built environment in a context of scarcity. And last but not least, Ruined Soils, Dark Ecologies and Hypotheses for Coexistence in Mexico City, Nicole Chacca. For the exploration of a complex and rather unexplored phenomenon through design, effectively using design as research, as well as clear and experimental representation. So I think we can give a first round of applause of the second. The jury is also glad to award the following citations for the thesis category. In Between, Bridging Earth and the Moon with the Architectural Project, Maria Pia Mammino, for the attempt to combine hard data and existing scenarios from institutions with the exploration of the unknown, and for using representation to explore a context hard to explore firsthand. Rethinking Iran's rural school buildings, spatial and process design for a charitable primary school building in Sistan and Baluchistan, Farshad Sadeghi, for a work that is technical, thorough, and solid, combining a site-specific approach and a large-scale problem framing, as well as from the attempt to use the thesis to trigger a process of change. Unearthing the colonial military past of Santa Marta, the urban renovation around the fortress of San Ferdinando in Santa Marta, Colombia, Frank Alexander Ramirez Gaitan, for the use of charts to explore analysis and design actions, and the synthesis of attention to the site, elaboration of design program, and material legacy. And finally, mediating resilience, examining critical regionalisms in the Arab world through the Aga Khan Award for Architecture, Ayman Hassanen, for a necessary evaluation of how architecture in Arab countries is framed in Western architectural discourse. And I think we can have a second round of applause for this. I'm now introducing and announcing you the winners for the category teachings. I just remember you that we accepted submissions coming from any kind of core. That's me, okay. Any kind of teaching of this architectural school that were somehow dealing with design, okay. So. Elaboration of a complex urban project in Skopje, North Macedonia, Greta Simonato, Silvia Rolando, Alice Morena, for the comprehension of the urban structure, the consistency of the strategy proposed, and the transcolor approach, as well as for the use of representation techniques. Restoration of East Attic of Valentino Castel, Kosar Mohammadi, Shadi Masihipur, Lucy Alna, Marie Schifano. For the integration of preservation and design and the effective and diverse use of representation for representing scientific and design contents. Former railway station of Morges, Giovanni Agricola, Chiara Di Mario, Vincenza Milletti, Anastasia Zabellina, for a work that is systemic and architectural at the same time, as well as site-specific in terms of architectural design and environmental control. Urban transformation for the area around the former Vanchiglia Railway Yard, Laura La Rocca, Antonio Mario Nicoletti, Ilian Stoikov, for the clear intellectual approach to urban design and for exploiting the iteration capacity of computation. Design of a new tourist settlement system in the Sentina Park Nature Reserve in San Benedetto del Tronto, Lorenzo Trevisan, Lorenzo Molino, Tommaso Abatelillo, Federica Racciu, for transcalarity and the ability of using design to turn weaknesses into strengths in Adriatic landscape. And just to conclude, the jury is glad also to award the following citations to the section teachings. A new productive chain of innovation as a model for conversion and regeneration of a former textile factory in the Biella region. Davide De Vito, Ilenia Marchitelli, Alessandro Comina, for putting to practice circularity in building design and exploring the construction process as an inherent part of the design. urban regeneration, urban morphology, and contemporary settlement patterns, Ginevra Bazzica, Mo-Hwai Hu, for the thorough consideration of urban context and the excellent integration of a big intervention into a complex urban fabric. And finally, refurbishment of a school building with a civic center, Doga Thiraj, Hatis Busra Öztürk, Clea Kaplani, for the synthesis between typology and spatial design and the ability to integrate an extensive program into an existing building using environmental control constraints as design tools. So I finish the citation, so let's have another round of applause.